let me introduce our speaker for today. So Huaping Lu-Adler is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Georgetown University. She is the author of the book from the Oxford University Press from 2018, Kant and the Science of Logic, and numerous other articles on Kant's logic, metaphysics, and philosophy of science. Her current project is a systematic and historically informed study of Kant's theory of race. She is very close to finishing a monograph titled The View from Somewhere, Kant, Race and Racism. So let us now introduce our speaker with her paper entitled Kant and Slavery, or Why He Never Became a Racial Egalitarian.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Christoph. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Everybody can hear me and see my screen, full screen. Is that correct? I cannot see anyone. Just give me a shout out. Okay, good. All right, great. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Christoph and Macarena for arranging the session, and Lucy for commenting on the paper. And thank you all for coming. I would like to begin with a trigger warning, if you may. I'll use the term Negro throughout this talk. You may find it offensive or at least uncomfortable, but let me briefly explain why I'll keep it as a special technical term in the context of this particular talk. It all goes back to Georges Buffon, whose work on natural history was very influential on Kant's racial thinking. Buffon divided the Blacks of Africa into two principal races, namely the Negroes from West Africa and the derogatively named Kafirs. The latter include all East Africans and the likewise derogatively named Hottentots. Buffon claims that these races are differentiated not only by their features, hair, skin, or smell, but also by their manners and natural dispositions. The way Buffon describes their key differences in the latter regard suggests that he's sizing them up from the perspective of slavery. The genuine Negroes are said to have little genius, but extremely acute feelings. They are, Buffon claims, exceedingly indolent, but strong and robust, and can be easily reconciled to servitude. Once in service, they are allegedly prone to contracting an affection to a master. By contrast, Buffon dismisses the Hottentots as a very singular species of savages who are fiercely protective of their independence and liberty. Kant draws a similar distinction between true Negroes and Hottentots. Like Buffon, Kant claims that Negroes are stupid, but physically robust and fit for hard labor. They are lazy, but at the same time full of passions and afraid of beatings, which makes them susceptible to training. So as far as Kant can tell, they can acquire none other than the culture of slaves. By contrast, Kant classifies Hottentots as savages, along with Amerindians and Australian Aboriginals. I'll return to this comparison later. Despite the similarity between Buffon's and Kant's depictions of Negroes vis-a-vis the savage race, one should resist the temptation to conclude that Kant was simply regurgitating the racist prejudices of his time. Kant's claim about the Negroes' alleged suitability for slavery will turn out to be much more lethal than Buffon's for three important reasons. First, Kant has an original theory of race, which gives the impression that the unique characteristics he attributes to Negroes are persistently hereditary. Second, he has a complex philosophical system that can endow his claims about Negroes with a deep significance. Third, as a lifelong educator, as well as a prominent philosopher, Kant was uniquely positioned to propagate claims about Negroes and contribute to the formation of a racist ideology about them. The second of these points will be my focus today, although I will end my talk by briefly highlighting the third point. To introduce my main thesis, let me begin with a partial overview of the state of Kant scholarship on the question of racism. Most scholars today, when asked, would acknowledge that Kant held racist views. but there is some disagreement about whether he maintained such views through the end of his life. The question is, as it is often framed, did Kant change his racist mind at some point? Pauline Kleingeld, in her seminal essay, Kant's Second Thoughts on Race, argues that Kant did in fact abandon racism and become more egalitarian with regard to race around the mid-1790s. This change of mind, according to Kleingeld, is most clearly reflected in Kant's condemnations of colonialism and slavery in Toward Perpetual Peace and the Metaphysics of Morals. Not everyone is convinced by Kleingeld's argument, however. A couple of scholars have forcefully countered that although Kant came to denounce the brutality in how slavery was practiced, it does not follow that he unambiguously rejected the very institution of slavery. And his eventual objection to colonialism was independent of his racial views, so that he could make that objection without abandoning his racist position. These counter-arguments did not seem to undermine people's trust, however, in the conclusion that Kant belatedly but definitively retracted his racist views and became some sort of racial egalitarian. Many Kant scholars uncritically repeat this conclusion, or at least are willing to give it a pass without closely scrutinizing the argument leading to it. In this talk, I will focus on one piece of evidence that Kleingeld used in her argument for Kant's late conversion to racial egalitarianism, namely his supposedly altered attitude toward chattel slavery. This is, according to Kleingeld, although Kant was at best silent about chattel slavery through the 1780s, he categorically and repeatedly condemned it during the 1790s. On my reading, however, the key textual materials that Kleingeld cited to support the conclusion that Kant later categorically condemned slavery either do not pertain to modern race-based chattel slavery at all, or at best suggest that while Kant was aware of the brutality of this type of slavery, he mentioned it primarily as cautionary tale for labor practice in Europe. In short, once properly contextualized, none of these texts demonstrates any genuine humanitarian concern, let alone egalitarian regard for the enslaved Negroes as human beings deserving moral respect and civil rights. Meanwhile, I'm willing to grant that in the 1790s, Kant expressed some qualms about the slave trade and about how slavery was practiced in the West Indian plantations. But he never presented chattel slavery as a moral problem to be addressed independently or with any urgency. Rather, he treated it primarily as a non-moral issue to be assessed in terms of its role in the history of human progress. If Kant ended up finding certain practices of slavery and the slave trade intolerable, it was mainly because he came to recognize their potential to impede progress by, for example, indirectly worsening intra-European power struggles and dimming the prospect of perpetual peace. Once again, the well-being, dignity, or freedom of the enslaved and traded Negroes never clearly entered the equation. Now, let's delve into the relevant texts. Let's begin with the Metaphysics of Morals. I will center my analysis on the passages that Kleingeld highlighted in her argument. In analyzing the relevant passages, Kleingeld simply assumed that whenever Kant mentioned slavery, he was referring to the modern race-based chattel slavery. This assumption turns out to be unwarranted in many cases. To be clear, modern chattel slavery, or race-based chattel slavery, was a system in which slaves, mostly West Africans, against their own will, were legally owned by someone else as properties, an ownership that can be legally transferred through inheritance, gifting, or transaction. This system was most notoriously encoded in the Code Noir, the royal edict that Louis XIV issued in 1685 to regulate the practice of slavery in the French West Indian colonies. The code was last edited in 1788, 3 years before the onset of the Haitian Revolution. Kant was evidently aware of this legally sanctioned treatment of human beings as mere properties, but never seemed to be troubled by it as an institutionalized practice whenever he did allude to it. In the Doctrine of Right, for instance, Kant includes the Black slaves on the coast of Guinea as an example of the goods that are traded in the marketplace. He has the opportunity to add right there that one ought not treat any human being this way, but he says nothing to this effect. Klangel does not take note of this explicit but morally indifferent reference to race-based chattel slavery. Instead, she points to other passages that, on her reading, suggest a categorical condemnation of chattel slavery on Kant's part. For instance, Kant claims that slavery contract is self-contradictory, and he argues that there is no place in the theory of right for beings who have merely duties and no rights, namely serfs and slaves. I have two responses to this reading. First, there was actually nothing new in these claims as far as Kant was concerned, because he already made similar claims more than a decade earlier in the Natural Right course lecture notes by Feyerabend from 1784. Second, given Kant's reference to contract, it should be evident that he was not referring to modern chattel slavery, which, as I clarified earlier, was definitely not based on any contract between the enslaved and the slave master. Rejecting slavery by contract still leaves room for other types of slavery. To see how, let's consider Kant's remarks about slavery in the Feyerabend lecture notes. In those notes, Kant distinguishes two kinds of slavery. One is voluntary slavery, the other is slavery through liability. The former is impossible according to Kant, because one can never relinquish his natural rights, otherwise he ceases being a person. The latter kind of slavery is possible, however, in that one can be made into a slave, especially in war or by committing crimes as a citizen of a state. That is, enslavement can be a society's revenge against one of its legal subjects for an intentional violation of its laws. Notably, Kant uses ancient Roman slavery to illustrate the status of a slave. The Romans, he writes, considered slaves as things, and so a slave could never do wrong. In other words, slaves lack legal personality, without which they cannot be held legally accountable for their doings. Accordingly, there is no place for them in the theory of right. Right is nothing other than the law of the equality of action and reaction between beings who themselves do have freedom, in relation to which the freedom of everyone else is limited. Things, or beings treated as things by contrast, could not be limited in their freedom. Since they have no freedom, there's nothing to limit in the first place. With this conceptual framework, let's return to Klangel's observation that for Kant, there is no place in the theory of right for beings who have merely duties and no rights, namely serfs and slaves. Klangel was referring to a section in the Doctrine of Right where Kant gives a division of duties of right in accordance with the relation of the subject imposing obligation to the subject put under obligation. There are 4 categories under this division, 3 of which are empty. These include the third category, which concerns the relation in terms of rights of human beings toward beings that have only duties but no rights. Kant remarks that this category is empty because these would be human beings without personality, serfs, slaves. Does this entail that Kant condemns serfdom or slavery? Not really. Kant may just be making a conceptual point similar to what he already suggested in the Feyerabend lecture, namely, that would-be slaves or serfs have no legal personality, and so there is no place for them in the theory of right, which must be a reciprocal relation between legal persons who are free to begin with. This says nothing about the morality of slavery or serfdom itself. What about Kant's rejection of slavery contract? Kant infers a categorical condemnation of chattel slavery from this rejection, but this inference collapses once we consider Kant's own stated reasons for rejecting voluntary slavery. Kant has a straightforward argument for why slavery contract is self-contradictory. To contract oneself into slavery is to renounce one's own personhood by contract. But one has to be a person in order to sign the contract in the first place. In this way, the act of self-enslavement by contract amounts to a logically impossible act of self-cancellation. In the meantime, just as he did in the Feyerabend lectures, Kant makes room for involuntary slavery. Although no human being in the state can be without any dignity, since he at least has a dignity of a citizen, Kant argues, a citizen can lose this dignity by committing a crime, whereby he is made a mere tool of another's choice, either of the state or of another citizen. Kant also adds, however, that there are legal limits to the involuntary slavery involving citizens of a state. That is, a citizen's subjection by his crime cannot be inherited because he has incurred it only by his own guilt. This qualification indicates a fundamental difference from race-based chattel slavery. In the latter case, as I pointed out earlier, the status of enslavement is heritable by law. This suggests that in his conceptual analysis of slavery, Kant does not even bother to treat chattel slavery as a unique case worth investigating, let alone condemn it. Now, Kant does make a passing reference to Negro slaves on the West Indian sugar plantations while arguing against the kind of contract by which one person leases himself to another for an indeterminate amount and period of service. Kant's reasoning goes as follows. If the master is authorized to use the powers of his subject as he pleases, he can also exhaust them until his subject dies or is driven to despair, as with the Negroes on the sugar islands. Notice what Kant is not saying in this passage. He is not protesting the treatment of those Negro slaves on sugar plantations as inhumane or unjust. Rather, he seems to be using the treatment of those plantation slaves as a realistic cautionary tale of what would happen if no legal limits were placed on the extent to which one free person can lease out his labor to another by contract. That is, such an unlimited contract would have virtually licensed the employer to use up the contract worker, much as a planter can use up his Negro slaves. In making this argument, Kant expresses no humanitarian concern for the plight of actual slaves themselves. To the contrary, he simply turns their case into the material for constructing a counterfactual to demonstrate the need to regulate the voluntary contractual labor relations between free citizens of a European state. This abstention from condemning race-based chattel slavery in the metaphysics of morals cannot be a casual oversight on Kant's part. Rather, there are reasons to suspect that being a systematic philosopher, Kant has a highly complex view on modern chattel slavery. On the one hand, he may concede that it is morally wrong if considered by itself, but he never publicly or unambiguously made such a concession, but I'm willing to grant it to him. On the other hand, Kant may nevertheless see modern racial slavery as an inevitable, albeit transient chapter in human history. We'll start seeing this picture when we read Kant's conception of the Negro race as naturally fit for the culture of slaves in connection with his developmental account of human history. Let's go back to Kant's account of the so-called true Negroes vis-a-vis Hottentots. He developed this unique profile of Negroes over time in both published works and lectures on physical geography and anthropology. It's also important to note that this profile of the Negro race is embedded in a larger system of racial profiles that Kant fleshes out in several notes and lectures on physical geography and anthropology. These profiles allow him to locate what he takes to be the four principal races of the human species in different parts of the arc of human history. While modern racial slavery does not properly constitute a stage of history, Kant may well see it as a functionally useful part of European civilization, at least up to a point. To see how Kant's philosophical system is capacious enough to accommodate this view, the first thing to note is that although he grants the same germs or chyma for perfection to all races, he also holds that those germs can fully develop only under appropriate conditions. These include internal conditions like drives, certain affects and passions, and such talents as the ability to form abstract concepts and principles. According to Kant's system of racial profiles, the white race alone is blessed with all these conditions, whereas each of the other races lacks one or more of them. This racialized attribution leads to racialized outcome with respect to progress. In short, only the white race will continue to approximate humanity's destiny of perfection, whereas the other three races are not granted any agential role in the historical progress, at least not from the early modern era onward. In the case of the Negro race, they are at best seen as useful objects, namely productive slaves to European civilization. This also seems to be the reason why Kant speaks of the Negro race more favorably than he does the race of Amerindians. He dismisses the latter race as a race of weak, indifferent, untrainable, and therefore useless savages. Even when they were used as slaves on some plantations, Kant claims, they could only do soft domestic chores. By contrast, the Negroes, being physically robust and susceptible to our coercive training, can toil in the sugar fields and withstand extremely hard labor. In case you wonder how this conceptualization of Negroes as natural slaves can possibly be reconciled with Kant's moral philosophy, it will be helpful to note that for any event or action, practice, etc., that takes place in space and time, Kant can assess it either on its own by certain moral principles or in relation to other events or actions, etc., from a purely historical standpoint. In these terms, Kant may see something as immoral from the first standpoint and yet give it a pass from the second. To see how he has conceptual space for this kind of position, we can find some clues in the idea for a universal history with a cosmopolitan aim from 1784. In this essay, Kant considers what meets the eye in individual subjects as confused and irregular, and yet in the whole species can be recognized as a steadily progressing, though slow development of its original predispositions. This distinction between individual and species is crucial to Kant's philosophy of history. For him, humanity as a species consists in a temporally extended series of generations, not an aggregate of individuals. Therefore, what is true of the entire human species may not be true of individual humans. In particular, if all natural predispositions of humanity are determined sometime to develop themselves completely and purposively, Kant argues that this complete development can be realized only in the species, but not in the individual. When looking at the overall historical trajectory of the human species, Kant assumes the viewpoint of a disinterested philosopher who, regarding human beings and their play in the large, cannot at all presuppose any rational aim of theirs. Rather, he only wants to see if he can discover an aim of nature in this nonsensical course of things human. If this disinterested focus on the historical arc of humanity as a species explains the lack of any unambiguous moral condemnation of the present reality of chattel slavery in the metaphysics of morals, it can also explain why Kant occasionally seems to express qualms about its practices in Toward Perpetual Peace, which was published 2 years earlier. Before I go into any details, it would be helpful to note some facts about the abolitionist movement that had been well underway by the mid-1790s. First off, there was an important distinction between the call to abolish slavery and the call to abolish the transatlantic slave trade. The first abolitionist organization was in fact called Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, which was founded in 1787. The English Parliament would pass the Slave Trade Abolition Act in 1807 and the Slavery Abolition Act much later in 1833. Kant was evidently aware of the English debates about abolition. It's now well known that he spoke approvingly of the anti-abolitionist James Tobin in his 1788 essay on race. What's not so well known is the fact that Kant also explicitly referred to the British parliamentary debates about the abolition of the slave trade in the Conflict of Faculties 10 years later in 1798, without indicating any support for the abolitionist side. It's also worth noting that a white person in Kant's time could have reasons or motivations other than the belief in racial equality to criticize either slavery or the slave trade. Realistically speaking, these include sentimental humanitarian impulse, political calculations, commercial interests, and so on. And most abolitionists seemed to perceive Negro slaves as passively begging for freedom, not as agents of historical change. This fact is clear from the symbol of the supplicant slave used by the British abolitionists, which is now criticized by many historians as paternalistic and demeaning. To provide further historical context for Kant's later remarks about slavery and the slave trade, two other historical developments in the 1790s are also worth mentioning. One is this Haitian Revolution, which started in 1791 and by the mid-1790s had turned into a three-way intra-European power struggle among England, Spain, and France, with England temporarily asserting domination. The other development is that 1792 saw the beginning of a series of wars between France and the rest of Europe, which according to some historians ultimately came down to France and Britain fighting each other for global hegemony. This period was also the so-called French period, during which much of Northern Europe would be controlled by France. Against this backdrop, let's turn to Kant's remarks about the practices of slavery and the slave trade in Toward Perpetual Peace and the unpublished notes he prepared for it. In these texts, Kant at times appears to show some qualms about the practice of slavery on the West Indian plantations and about the slave trade. But his stated reasons for such qualms must disappoint anyone who remembers him mainly as a moral philosopher and therefore expects from him an unmistakably moral objection to the very institution of plantation slavery and the slave trade. Such an objection would explicitly invoke, for instance, the unconditional worth of the slaves on account of their humanity. In reality, however, Kant seems much more concerned about the political ramifications for Europe than he is about the plight of the actual slaves themselves. He writes in Toward Perpetual Peace, for instance, the worst of this, or considered from the standpoint of a moral judge, the best, is that the commercial states do not even profit from this violence, that all these trading companies are on the verge of collapse, that the sugar islands, that place of the cruelest and most calculated slavery, yield no true profit, but serve only immediate and indeed not very laudable purpose, namely training sailors for warships, and so, in turn, carrying on wars in Europe. In the Notes for Toward Perpetual Peace, Kant argues that the slave trade is problematic because, first, it is in itself already an offense against the hospitality of Black people. By the way, while Kleingeld interprets this reference to the hospitality of Black peoples as evidence that Kant repeatedly and explicitly criticized slavery of non-Europeans in the strongest terms as a grave violation of cosmopolitan right of Blacks, the surrounding passages suggest another possibility. That is, Kant is talking about the Europeans' cosmopolitan right to limited hospitality as the right of a foreigner against the owner of land. Obviously, the visiting foreigner here is the European. The hospitality in question is not obviously reciprocal. At any rate, Kant goes on to suggest that his real concern is that the violations some European states have committed overseas now clearly threaten to ricochet onto themselves, with the specter of a perpetual war in this part of globe. And given the historical developments I mentioned earlier, an equally bad but also increasingly realistic possibility would be a super-imperialist world order where one European state exerts hegemony over all the other. Plantation slavery and the slave trade were an integral part of the battle for such global hegemony, insofar as they had a significant impact on the material wealth of nations like England and France, on whose navy could control the global trade routes and on who could leverage such control in international relations, and so on. Granted, unlike what he did in the 1780s, Kant now signals some disapproval of the cruelest and most calculated practice of slavery in the West Indies and of the slave trade. If this counts as a change of mind about chattel slavery, however, it is an extremely modest one. As I pointed out earlier, Kant never explicitly endorsed the abolition either of slavery or of the slave trade, even when he had perfect opportunities to do so. Furthermore, even if Kant came to reject chattel slavery itself, it would not follow that he became a sort of racial egalitarian. As history has given us plenty of examples, even the most ardent abolitionist can still hold anti-Black racism by failing to recognize Blacks as agents of historical change and of their own fate. In Kant's case, while we can plausibly connect his belated criticisms of plantation slavery and of the slave trade with the changing political realities in the 1790s, we have little to no evidence to think that he suddenly had an epiphany about the dignity or agency of the Negro race. Meanwhile, there are at least two theoretical obstacles to the racial egalitarian conversion that never happened on Kant's part. On the one hand, we have Kant's scientific theory of race and the system of racial profiles structured around his rigid racial classification. These were not simply products of sloppy thinking, but were things that Kant thought about, labeled over, and knew how to connect with other parts of his system. This means that he would need a lot of compelling reasons to reverse them. On the other hand, we have Kant's developmental theory of human history. Central to that theory are two distinctions that I mentioned earlier, namely the distinction between species and individuals, and the related distinction between nature's end and the ends of individual humans. The first distinction, coupled with Kant's racial theory, gives him conceptual room to exclude certain groups of individuals on account of their racial characteristics from equal agential participation in the human species' historical progress toward the moral destiny that he has envisioned. The second distinction, namely the distinction between nature's end and the ends of individual humans, allows Kant to hold a very nuanced attitude toward things like chattel slavery. Although he never explicitly said this much, he might see chattel slavery as morally wrong in itself, for the reason that one human being ought not use another as mere means to his end. At the same time, however, Kant could also see chattel slavery as an economic arrangement conducive to nature's end, until it no longer seemed to serve this end well in the 1790s. To be clear, in making this point, I'm not saying that Kant saw chattel slavery as morally permissible. Rather, my reading is that even if he recognized it as morally wrong, the disinterested philosopher of history in him knew how to look away. By the way, Kant has a whole theory of abstraction to make sense of this intellectual indifference. Now, let me conclude by saying that in pushing back against the narrative that Kant finally changed his racist mind, my ultimate goal is not simply to settle the debate about whether or for how long he was a racist, but to go beyond the individualist approach that has dominated the conversation about Kant's relation to racism for way too long. As I suggested earlier in the talk, one reason why Kant's racist claims are so much more lethal than Buffon's is the fact that he was a lifelong educator as well as a rigorous and prominent philosopher. In this position of power, Kant was well situated to play an outsized role in the formation of a recognizably modern racist ideology. For this reason, even if Kant made a belated personal conversion to racial egalitarianism, he could hardly undo the racist worldviews that he might have helped to cultivate or affirm in his broadest audiences. This means that insofar as we call ourselves Kant scholars or Kantians, we're burdened with Kant's racist legacies. So it's not by a noble choice, but from the recognition of an unshakable obligation that we must participate in the ongoing anti-racist struggles, both as professional philosophers and, for many of us, as educators. I'll leave you at this point. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to Lucy's comments and then the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Huaping. It's my great pleasure and honor to welcome and introduce our commentator for today's event, Lucy Allais. Lucy has recently moved to Johns Hopkins University and continues to work for part of the year at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Before joining the philosophers at Johns Hopkins, Lucy was the Henry E. Ellison Chair of the History of Philosophy at the University of California in San Diego. Lucy has published widely on Kant's philosophy, both its theoretical as well as its practical dimensions. And she's currently working on the idea of human freedom in Kant's work, including looking at freedom in terms of metaphysics, politics, and moral psychology. Lucy has published her work in many prestigious journals, such as Philosophy and Public Affairs, the Journal of the History of Philosophy, and Philosophical Studies. She's also the author of the widely discussed book, Manifest Reality, Kant's Idealism and Realism, and recently co-authored a fascinating collection of essays on Kant and animals. So I think without much further ado, please let us welcome Lucy Allais as we look forward to her comments on Huaping's project. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for that invitation. Thanks for arranging the event and thanks for paying for the paper. So Huaping's, oh, wait, I'm going to share some slides, if that works. That works?
Works.
So the paper presents a really interesting argument about Kant's thinking about slavery and how this relates to his systematic positions and his relation to racism, which I think is just extremely important and interesting work. She makes a good case for the claim, I think, that Kant's central theoretical arguments about slavery in the metaphysics of morals don't concern modern chattel slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. And I think she's right to point out the extent to which Kant fails to say much about chattel slavery and how shocking this should be from the point of view of his supposedly universal moral and political theories. And I appreciate the approach to Kant's systematicity, so working out the relation between his theory of history and his theory of race and his moral and political philosophy. I think it's a really important project. That's the issue that my comments are going to be addressed to. And just to say, I think there was some sort of differences in emphasis in the paper that I read and the presentation today. So my comments are really addressed to the question of whether, if one looks at Kant's works as a whole systematically, the overall systematic view is most plausibly interpreted as thinking that chattel slavery is a non-moral issue or not to be assessed as a moral problem. And that's the claim that my comments are primarily engaging with. So one of her central arguments pushes back against a series of papers in which Pauline Kleingeld has argued that Kant's racism changes becoming less bad over the course of his writings. And a central part of her case, of Kleingeld's case, is that Kant seems to condemn slavery and colonialism in his very late political texts. And Huaping has a series of arguments against this. So she argues that the slavery Kant excludes in the metaphysics of morals isn't chattel slavery, that he repeatedly fails to specifically condemn the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery in the Americas, even when he's talking about them, that when he does condemn slavery, she argues his criticisms aren't based on concern with the well-being, dignity, or freedom of enslaved Blacks. And she argues that these failures are systematically integrated into his philosophical system. So in order to make this argument, she appeals to his theory of race and his philosophical theory of human history. And she concludes that Kant, taken systematically, didn't consider slavery to be a moral problem on its own, but rather a non-moral issue to be assessed in terms of its role in human history. So I think that in terms of the argument about the discussions of slavery and the metaphysics of morals being more closely concerned with Roman slavery than modern chattel slavery, I think this is an interesting and worthwhile point. I don't really see that it tells against the idea that the system of the metaphysics of morals is inconsistent with all forms of slavery. So Kant explicitly discusses and rules out as impermissible forms of slavery that seem less horrific and extreme than modern chattel slavery. So if his position is inconsistent with less extreme forms of slavery, it's surely also a fortiori inconsistent with more extreme forms of slavery. I thought that she accepted this because she agrees that there's no place in the theory of right for human beings without personality. But I think there was some pushback against that in the talks as to whether those claims, who those claims actually apply to. So I think that is an interesting question to discuss. Now, of course, whether the system Kant presents is inconsistent with chattel slavery is a different question from whether he was opposed to or criticized chattel slavery. So I take it that her central case isn't based on showing that the theory of right is consistent with chattel slavery or could support it, but rather that Kant fails to condemn it. So showing that, and I think that this failure is a very important point, and I want to come back to say something about that at the end. But I just want to note now that while I agree he does fail very seriously in this regard, he doesn't say nothing. And I think that what he does say does indicate that at least in the late political works, he regards it as clearly wrong. So I want to separate out two questions. Does he fail to adequately condemn chattel slavery? And do the late texts give us grounds for thinking that he thinks it's either acceptable or not a moral issue? So I agree with her on the first question, but not on the latter. So I agree with her that his reference to the slaves on the Sugar Islands in the discussion about impermissible contracts almost appears as an aside. And I think she's rightly critical of this. And that's the first question. But I think it's also clear that in that very argument, he's saying that these people are treated in a way in which it's not permissible to treat a person. Now, she suggests that this passage is a cautionary tale about the lack of legal limits on contracts. So that is concerned there is protecting contractual rights of European laborers. And I agree that that's a large part of what he's arguing. But I think that the argument turns on thinking that the way the slaves are treated is impermissible. So I don't think he can be neutral on that issue. So like Robert Bernasconi, she appeals to this passage in the Perpetual Peace, in which both she and Bernasconi focus on Kant's criticizing the fact that slavery doesn't make a profit. And they present this as his central opposition to it and his central criticism. But they don't comment on his saying that this is the best result from the standpoint of the moral judge, which I think just straightforwardly means that he thinks it's wrong. So in order to think that the failure to make a profit takes precedence, one would have to attribute to him a view on which moral rightness is conditional on prudential rightness, which is very hard to relate to his systematic views. And I think it's also important that the context of this passage is in a discussion of the hostile behavior of European states, which Kant is clearly condemning. And he says of states in our part of the world that the injustice they show in visiting foreign lands and peoples, which with them is tantamount to conquering them, goes to horrifying lengths, that under the pretext of setting up trading relations, they brought oppression. And I think that taking these points together, you know, his description of these European authorities as drinking wrongfulness like water, and that the moral judge has to judge this lack of profit to be the best outcome, I think suggests that in fact, the way to read this passage is that he's saying, whereas ancient slavery might at least have been in some sense prudentially rational, this modern slavery is so irrational that it doesn't even make prudential sense for the ex-slavers and looks like pure barbaric destruction. In support of the argument that Kant never considered slavery as a moral problem to be evaluated on its own, but rather a non-moral issue to be evaluated in terms of its role in the history of human progress, she appeals to his writings on history, and in particular, his giving slavery a role in a story of human progress in comments he makes in his notes. Now, I think this is a very interesting and worth exploring further issue. The Kant's teleological account of history is extremely strange, and I think to really make this as a systematic case, one would first need an argument about what these essays are even supposed to be about, which I think isn't totally obvious. But I think it is clear that in his teleological account of history, Kant attributes human progress to things he indisputably thinks are wrong, primarily war. And he doesn't present it as a good thing or even a pragmatically neutral thing that war drives human progress. Rather, he postulates it as an attempt to think about the idea of nature as having an aim, where the postulated aim of nature could make sense of miserable human history. So if we think of nature played out in human history as having an aim, he says nature drives them to what reason could have told them even without much sad experience. Now here he's clearly not defending the war nature is postulated to make use of, because reason is against it. It's also true that in this essay on history, he talks about pragmatic concerns. So he talks about how infringing human freedom undermines commerce and trade. But he does not argue that freedom is valuable because it's good for trade. Rather, he's giving an account of pragmatic and instrumental reasons states have for creating freedom. So in postulating nature as having a goal to explain miserable human history, he clearly attributes progress to forces he doesn't approve of, delusions, whims, selfish aggrandizement. And in order to argue that he gives pragmatic concern of European economic progress precedence over moral concerns in an overall picture, we would need to, again, to attribute to him a view of moral value as conditional and prudential value as prior to it. And I think that's very hard to reconcile systematically with his views. So I think if we're really going to look at the philosophy of history systematically, there's more to be said about what he's doing in those essays. And a complete systematic account would have to have more to say about how this relates to his moral and political philosophy. And I just want to say a little bit about that. So Huaping argues that Kant's moral philosophy, his conception of history, his political theory, and his racial views are more intricately connected than the dominant discourse about his relation to racism has assumed. And she gives us an interesting account of the systematicity of his theories of race and his theories of history, but she doesn't say much about the systematic connections between the position she attributes to him, that slavery isn't a moral concern, and how to understand his moral and political theories. And I think there are some real complications here. So one question that arises is how we should interpret Kant's claims about humanity and persons as they feature throughout his practical philosophy. Now, of course, a possible move here is the one Charles Mills makes, to say that Kant's moral philosophy is meant to apply to those he considers moral persons, and that Kant takes this to be white men. In the written paper, she said a few things which I took to endorse this, but I'm not sure that she does endorse this move by Mills. So if one were to take that, try to read Mills's view into the political philosophy, one could perhaps say that the systematic view is that Roman slavery is impermissible for moral persons, but chattel slavery is permissible for humans who are not full moral persons. Now, I don't think one could make a developed and systematic account that makes sense of this in relation to the total system of rights in the metaphysics of morals, which, just to note, isn't the focus of Charles Mills's work. He focuses on the moral and not the political philosophy. And I think it's harder to make his Untermenschen proposal consistent with the political philosophy, because in the political philosophy, Kant does clearly assign juridical personhood to persons on all continents. So despite the extremely racist things he says about Native Americans, he says it's not justifiable to colonize their lands. It's not even permissible to settle on their lands without their permission, and that this permission must be genuinely granted and not the result of deceptive contracts. He also talks about the Hottentots in that exact passage. Despite the terrible things he says about Asian people, he defends China and Japan's entitlement to keep out Europeans and even praises them for it in the light of Europe's destructive role in India. And this suggests that he takes his principles of justice to apply to all peoples of the earth. And it's very hard to see how to make this consistent, I think, with Mills's Untermensch proposal. Now, I do not argue that this shows that he's no longer a racist. Being opposed to those wrongs is consistent with being a racist. But I do think it poses problems for thinking on systematic grounds that his settled and systematic view could be that there is no moral problem with modern chattel slavery. So I think a properly systematic account would need to say something about how to interpret these claims in his moral and political theories. So at the end of the paper that I read, Huaping concludes that we should stop looking at the racism of Kant the person and the scholar and rather address the question of the racist legacy he helped to shape. And I completely agree about addressing the legacy. I find it a little soon to stop looking at the racism of Kant the person and the scholar, given how recently in the 200 years of Kant scholarship, many people have been paying attention to this. And I think that paying attention to this is not unrelated to addressing the legacy. So in the paper, she suggests that there's sort of a particular set of questions to do with Kant's relation to race that are the important ones, whereas I think there's just very many that are important: his racism, his theory of race, his legacy, his system, how this affects how we understand what liberal philosophy is, how it affects our conception of what Western philosophy is, the origins of Western philosophy, and I think we should address all of these questions. So I've argued in other work that Kant's racist views can't be made consistent with his moral and political philosophy. And in the paper, she finds this move quite suspicious. Now, I think that there are lots of different forms racism can take. And I do think that there are forms that lead people into very inconsistent, thoroughly self-deceived, and even delusional positions, worldviews, and attitudes. And I think that I experienced this growing up firsthand growing up in apartheid South Africa, but I think you can also look around the contemporary United States to see this. So I agree with Robert Bernasconi, who says that rather than trying to make Kant consistent, we need to pay attention to the ease with which moral theories are divorced from practice, precisely because so many of us fail in this regard. And I just want to comment with just a few comments about that. So, and what we can all, one of the things that I think we can take that's really important to take from paying attention to these issues in Kant. So paying attention, I think, not just to Kant's racism, but to the inconsistency of his views, to his failings, to his missed opportunities for condemning atrocity, I think should be a lesson to us all to think very carefully about our own views and failings in regard to racism, but also other dehumanizing attitudes in philosophy. So for how long has analytic moral philosophy casually talked about the idea of blowing up a fat man or pushing a fat man onto an oncoming train in discussions, or casually talked about the lives of differently abled people in discussions of abortion, casually used toy examples of addiction that don't relate to anything about what addiction is actually like to make clever counterexamples in debates about free will. When I was a graduate student, there was a lot of discussion in South Africa about the failures of white liberal philosophers to address apartheid in their work. So while being ostensibly opposed to apartheid, the white philosophy journals during that time feature almost no work on the wrong of apartheid. They publish mostly work on abstract debates about utilitarianism and emotivism, as if apartheid wasn't even happening or wasn't worthy of philosophical concern. And at the time when we were talking about these things, I thought that this was an important critique picking out a particular failing of white South African philosophy. Now, it certainly was doing that, but it's instructive to look at a journal like Ethics from 1955 to 1965 to see just how little North American philosophy engages with the movement for civil rights for Black Americans or the Vietnam War happening at the time. So I hope that if you were to go through Ethics from 1955 to 1965, which I just skimmed the titles and abstracts before doing this, you would find it pretty shocking. Now, I wouldn't assume that this shows that all those philosophers thought segregation wasn't a moral problem. It might show something about what they thought philosophy was and what it should be engaging with. And I think that this was a serious failing in our discipline. Talking about this is not intended as whataboutery that is meant to defend Kant's casual references to slavery in the Sugar Islands. Rather, I want to argue for the importance of taking seriously the possibility of radical inconsistency and failings and the implications of this for the state of the tradition that we have inherited. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lucy. I think, Huaping, you want to respond right away, or are we having our break?
Maybe
now,
let's take a break because it has been an hour. Shall we just take a 5-minute break? Is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds good. Okay, see you in 5 minutes then.
Yeah.
But to your recording in progress. Okay. Good, Huaping. Please let us know.
Okay, I'm ready. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Lucy, for this super rich response and very challenging response. And I cannot possibly do justice to the whole, the entirety of it. I just want to kind of point out, say a couple of things. The first thing, I think that's the most important thing to kind of emphasize is that I think Lucy and I agree that both of us agree in the end that there is still so much more work to be done on this particular topic. And I think both of us would like to see more work, being done by, the community of Kant scholars. Now, I think I also want to emphasize that in this work, I want to emphasize the viewpoint diversity. So we can reasonably disagree about some fundamentals. And I think I'm not trying to kind of say, ideological reading is the only reading to go. So I just want to clarify that I'm not trying to say that, stop studying, racist attitudes and all these kind of things, because these are real and we're still grappling with them. But I have both scholarly reasons and personal reasons to want to go beyond the individualist approach. So one of the reasons is that this individualist approach has been basically the only game in town, and has been misused, I say, to basically sideline the research that still needs to be done about Kant and racism. And often what I call this is the strategy of so-called otherizing the racist Kant to save his philosophy. I think that this makes the job a little bit too easy for us. I'm not kind of disputing again, like, the work needs to be done, like the work that Lucy has done. That's really, really important to study what the racist mind is about. But I just think that we need to do more than just saying that. And then we need to be very careful about personalizing Kant's racism and then just move on. I don't think that that's okay, right? I also have a personal reason to want to go beyond I don't want to call anybody racist because as someone who has been at the receiving end of racism, especially over the last couple of years during COVID, has been really hard for people in my community. The last thing I want to do is to call anyone racist, because that's really not good for my mental health. And for me, my approach, and many people in my community's approach, is to understand the history, to understand how we got here, and to understand why people would call me, like, tell me to go back to Asia, and that kind of thing. I don't want to just say that they are racist. I wanted to understand how we got here and why they think the way they do. And also the racist attitudes, we should distinguish between the racist attitudes on the side that has the power to kind of exert this kind of racist control, and on the side, like people at the receiving end. So often I wonder about my own internalized racism toward my own race. And I think the way we understand, the way we try to understand, say, a racist attitude on the part of a white person should be quite different from the way we understand how racist attitudes came about and how they manifested themselves on the part of people who are at receiving end, who are racialized and racially minoritized, and my own internalized racist attitudes. I would be the first person to call myself a racist if I'm going to call anyone racist. So I want to understand, like, how come that I, right, kind of internalized racist toward myself. And that's I think that's a kind of phenomenon that requires a unique kind of explanation. So if we do go there, if we do talk about racist attitudes, we should also be mindful that in like the kind of analysis we give of Kant's racist attitudes can have its limitations in what kind of phenomena it can cover. I also want to kind of point out something, maybe I should share my screen again. This is something that's, I think that's a kind of important, but let me see. Okay, so by the way, I did finish my book manuscript. I finished in February, so it's not under review. And this is the cover I intend to use. If anybody knows the copyright of this image, please let me know. I found it online. I think this is like the most apt depiction of Kant, right, with his hand on the globe. This reflects his interest in physical geography and his global perspective. And I think that's really important. So one thing I want to kind of talk about is this claim that there is this contradiction between this assumption of logical contradiction between Kant's moral theory and his racist claims. So I think that the entire debate so far about Kant and racism has been such that they build on this kind of shared assumption that there is this contradiction, logical contradiction between the two sides. I really think we should think really deeply. This is where we can have, Lucy and I can have reasonable disagreement about the fundamentals of Kant's system. But what I want to call is that don't take it for granted that there is a logical contradiction between Kant's moral philosophy and his racist claims. And so here's a quintessential, I also disagree with Mills in this regard. Here's the way Mills talks about contradiction. And he generated this contradiction by by formulating Kant's moral universalism as a claim about, a general claim about all biological humans. And this interpretation, I mean, Mills is trying to kind of give an interpretation of the categorical imperative, especially the formula of humanity. This interpretation as a textual interpretation just is not right, because Mills is talking about all biological humans, but Kant is not talking about biological humans when he talks about, say, the formula of humanity. Here's a formula in its original formulation, right? Kant is talking about humanity, the humanity in your person. He's not talking about concrete human beings, as Henry Allison explains very clearly in his commentary on the groundwork. Kant, in this particular formula, is not talking about particular human beings. He's not even talking about human species. It's just, as Henry Allison puts it, it's just a shorthand for the rational nature. It's again, so I think this is important, this gap between how Kant intended his formula of humanity and how it has been interpreted, the categorical imperative has been interpreted, needs to be scrutinized. And this interpretation that Mills gave has never been seriously challenged. So just to quickly, this is a kind of probably in a response to Lucy's invitation to say a little bit more about the system. This is a chart I used I actually dedicated an entire chapter, the very first chapter of my book, is really to talk about whether there is we can generate contradiction. Again, I'm not trying to make Kant consistent where, I see inconsistency. I honestly just don't see inconsistency. So I'm ready to be, to change my mind. But the way I'm looking at like different parts of Kant's system, this is just some of them. Kant is very careful about distinguishing different levels of discourse. And he has different notions of human being in these different levels of discourse. And often when we say that there is this contradiction between his moral claims and his racist claims, which are about concrete, spatially, temporally particularized, embodied inhabitants of the earth, these are very different discourse. We should not collapse them. Now, of course, I had to write the whole book, and it's a very long chapter to explain how different parts come together. So I just want to say that I think, let's just say there is definitely a lot of work to be done to figure out exactly how everything fit together. So I'm just going to stop there, and I want to hear what the audience's reaction is going to be.
Well, thank you to both of you, Huaping and Lucy, and to everyone who is here. It's two wonderful presentations, and I'm eager to see what everybody else has to say. So I'm gonna assign this random order. My Zoom little windows are such as to me. So first, Alisa.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, Lisa.
Okay, thank you. Extremely interesting pair of talks. I'm very glad it was arranged, very glad I managed to attend. I look forward to reading the book when it comes out.
Thank you.
And reading more of Lucy's work. And I just wanted to point out that Huaping, is that how you pronounce your name?
Yes, perfect.
Early in your talk, you said something to the effect, and I took down certain words verbatim, that the well-being, dignity, and freedom of enslaved persons never entered Kant's text. And it struck me that these ideas of dignity, freedom, and well-being have been illuminated by Kant's works. And I wonder whether you agree, And I also wonder, who else do you think has illuminated those concepts as well or better than Immanuel Kant?
I'm not denying that, Kant illuminated a lot of important language we're using, right? I am kind of using Kant language to talk about this whole thing. So I don't know, like, what that you are implying with the question. Like, I'm trying to like just like deny that Kant has illuminated questions and like concepts in important ways that we're still using to talk about some of these issues. No, I'm not.
May I
if
follow
that's
up?
the question. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted perhaps greater clarity about your further purposes, because I think that it's very likely that the effects of your work, including your argument that his racism is not, you can't disentangle it from his systematic moral and political philosophy. I think the effect, whether it's explicitly and intentionally your aim, will be to turn people away from Kant and make them turn against people who are taking Kant seriously and studying his works with respect for them.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I definitely see that as a worry. I mean, I see myself as a Kant scholar, and my next two or three book projects are still about Kant. So I understand that there is this kind of like very simplistic way of looking at the debate, is like those people who want to study Kant and those people who are not interested in Kant, and they just move away from Kant, and this like cancel culture and things like that. People say that, but I say, I actually have been asked this question, like, are you canceling Kant? All right, what do you think of cancel culture? And my personal response is that I actually can't afford to cancel Kant. I want to understand him because he is part of the big historical picture. And, again, I come at this topic partly from my lived experience with racism. And I sometimes say, this is my truth and reconciliation project with Kant. And in the conclusion to my book, it's basically a call to dig deeper. And I directly respond to anybody, I don't know anybody personally who say, let's just cancel Kant. No, like there was this kind of so-called, do you like topple the so-called metaphorical Kant statue? I said, no, bring it down a notch so that we can see him at eye level, we can engage with him. And so that's what I'm trying to say. And I'm still kind of inviting people to study Kant, because again, if you just take out Kant, then there's an important part of history we're just not understanding. So it does not have to be either or. Either we kind of like embrace Kant, just like with just complete love, and or like just stop studying him altogether. We need to find some more subtle middle ground and keep doing Kant if that's what you're called to do. And like I'm still doing it. It's just that I'm trying to invite people to think, to be more curious about where the racist stuff shows up, and how, when you ask the question about race, how you're going to do your work differently. I give a ton of examples in the conclusion to my book, precisely as an invitation for people to continue to do the work. It's just like right now, the status quo, the situation is that this study is so marginalized and so dismissed that it's just not right. So that's a dialectic context I'm doing this work. So I
look forward to reading the conclusion. I look forward to
Okay.
reading the conclusion of your book. And I just wanted to encourage everybody to read the concluding chapters of Arthur Ripstein's book, Force and Freedom, in which he makes clear the importance to him of Kant's moral and political philosophy in light of his mother's experience as a Jew under the Nazi regime. And I have similar respect for Kant for that reason, as the moral philosophy and political philosophy that best articulates the wrongness of genocide and dismissal of people on racial grounds, he himself is not the only thing that we are valuing when we are studying his systematic moral and political philosophy. That was my main point. I'm not accusing you of canceling Kant.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now I have Martin Sticker.
Hey, thanks for your talk, both of you. Really interesting stuff. So just one conceptual point. So Huaping, you argued that slavery, chattel slavery, was a non-moral issue for Kant, but you also claimed, if I understand correctly, that the formula of humanity does rule out chattel slavery, but it seems that, according to your reconstruction, Kant thought that somehow the badness of this is outweighed by certain teleological assumptions or by functions for human progress. But if it is correct that, according to the formula of humanity, chattel slavery is prima facie ruled out, then clearly that would be a moral issue, right? It might just be the case. It might just be the case that Kant thought that maybe just prima facie the non-instrumentalization requirement gives us reasons to be against slavery. Is just that there are other considerations that weigh more and that can outweigh the badness of slavery, right? But it seems, even according to your reconstruction, when you talk about the formula of humanity, it clearly is a moral issue. And the problem is rather that it doesn't have the appropriate weight or something like that.
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, sorry, the second point. One of the things that I thought after your talk is if you're right, could actually the problem be for Kant that for once he wasn't rigoristic enough, right? Because it seems that what we have is a pretty stringent duty, never treat people merely as a means, but that he somehow thought that even if people being treated as a means, this can be somehow outweighed by certain teleological aims that can be furthered by certain forms of slavery, right? I think you did construct this tension between, on the one hand, there is this never treat merely as a means, but on the other hand, there are certain teleological considerations. So do we have a paradoxical structure that if Kant had been more of a rigorist than he actually was, he would have actually said, no, there's a perfect duty here not to treat people merely as means. It doesn't matter what this does for world history. We can't, just as we can't lie to the murderer, we can't allow slavery, except that in the case of the murderer, it seems a problem for Kant that he said that, whereas in the case of slavery, it would have been really good if Kant had been more rigoristic, even more of a Kantian than he actually was.
Great, thank you for these questions. I'm glad you asked these questions. So about the formula of humanity, the way I'm bringing up, I was emphasizing that Kant was speaking at this domain, at this level of abstraction, that he's not talking about humans in concreto at all. So often people say, okay, look at Kant's formula of humanity. Isn't that anti-racist? I said, I would say, no, it's irrelevant in a way. It's too abstract. It's not about concrete human beings at all. So I think if you may, you can just say, people say, well, doesn't Kant's, Kant, people tend to think of Kant's formula of humanity as this kind of general claim that can be generalized over the domain of all concrete human beings. And I'm claiming that it's a misreading of the formula of humanity. The formula of humanity, again, is at such a higher level of abstraction. So Kant himself, right, wants to find all these like middle links between very abstract principles, which he says, I have to establish in abstracto, namely in abstraction from all the conditions, conditions of human embodiment, historical conditions, all these kind of things, right? It's so abstract, it does not say anything about how to directly judge about, anything that's going on. And so if Kant would say that, the chattel slavery is morally wrong, I'm not sure like exactly how he goes, which principles he would invoke to talk about it. I'm not sure, it's directly by invoking the categorical imperative. I'll leave that open. The second question, So I think this probably also helps to clarify what I'm not saying, right? I'm not saying that Kant would then eventually, would say on the one hand, slavery is impermissible and morally wrong, and on the other hand, just weigh it again with all the factors and find it permissible again. I'm not trying to say that. So what I'm trying to say is that Kant actually, I think it was in Conflict of Faculty or Theory of Practice. I think it's probably in Conflict of Faculty. Kant mentioned this other called for this other Copernican turn that we don't talk much about, namely the Copernican turn in looking at historical events. And he's responding to the kind of Rousseauian critique of European civilization, right? The Rousseauians would say, or some Rousseauians would say that, look, the European civilization is so corrupting, right? Look at all the evils it brought about and things like that. Kant would say, yeah, of course, if I look at them just like, as, little segment of history, I'm also like, yeah, if I just look at them, they look so evil and it's bad. But we need to zoom out. This is literally Kant said, we need to change perspective, namely just like the Copernicus did, zoom out and look at the history. And just, so what this zoom out does is to shift, reorient the place you're looking at. So that's why I mentioned Kant's notion of abstraction. So it's not so much that Kant takes the same historical event like historical practice like slavery and weigh it in one way and then weigh it the other way. No, it's like he can first look at just look at by itself. So, oh yeah, that's evil, totally. But then he zooms out. Once he zooms out, he just looks away. He just doesn't see it anymore. He just looks away so that he could focus on the historical trajectory of humanity. And so that's his response. I may think of the dialectic context here matters. He's responding to the kind of view that kind of romanticizes the past, so to speak. Kant wants to say, there is this inevitable progress that's guaranteed by providence. We need to keep going forward. And there's some hope when we zoom out, even though we're confronted with a ton of evils. I don't know, does that make sense? That's why I said it's a kind of intellectual, like this kind of methodological turn, this kind of perspective shift resulted in the kind of intellectual indifference. Not so much he's saying now it's permissible.
I think that's very interesting. That's very interesting. And I think it does have great synergy with a lot of stuff that Lucy does on self-deception and racism, right? Because you're describing a certain form of self-deception here, directing attention, right? I think Laura Perpish also works on that a lot. So I do think that's super interesting and helped me understand the problem, because I thought it was something like weighing evils against each other or something like that, but that would be weird on Kant's framework. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you, Martin. Now, Ido Geiger.
Hi, yeah. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
So thank you, Huaping, for really deep, interesting talk and for undertaking this project. I think it's absolutely, it's important, and I'm sure the book will be great. And Lucy for a wonderful response. I think I want to ask a question sort of in the spirit of Lucy's words, sort of Lucy's words and her and Lucy, your profound written work on this. I think there are deep lessons to learn from reading Kant about the racist mind, right? About the sort of self-deception that occurs in all of us. So I want to invite you to say a little bit more about something you didn't talk about but only mentioned, and that's Kant's biological theory of race. I always thought that Kant's obvious racism was all the more noxious for having a non-racist race theory, and in fact being, if I understand it correctly, and if I'm not mistaken historically, for being one of the only theorizers of race in his time, perhaps the only one, whose notion of race is sort of, I would say, morally neutral. If I understand Kant correctly, the only truly racial property is skin color, and skin color is an adaptation to climate. So this doesn't save him from the charge of racism, but in fact, I think in the spirit of Lucy's thinking, it makes it all the worse, because he has the resources of a racist theory that thinks of race as something purely neutral, morally or evaluatively, right? Race means your race is the history of your adaptation to the climate in which from which you originated, I guess. So I think I've heard you say really interesting things about that before, but I'd be really happy if you could say them, at least some of them again.
Okay, great. You were referring to my talk about savagery. So thank you so much. I think this really raises a question as to how you evaluate a biological theory of race, right? I go into that. I'm very much aware of that. I do that in my book. So like I devoted two probably longest chapter to how Kant became interested in the topic of race. And I think you're right. In the three essays on race, he mainly takes the perspective of what he called Naturforscher, right? And philosophical investigator of nature. So he saw it as a purely speculative project. Speculative means theoretical, right? He brought some of his most interesting insights in his philosophy of science, in how he looks at his metaphysics of nature to bear, right? His deepest philosophical theoretical commitments are at play when he looks at biological theory, developed his biological theory of race. So that can be granted. I actually try to give an intellectually sympathetic reading of that, right? I wanted to see like how Kant, why, what did it feel like for Kant to become so interested and so dedicated to this topic, biological issue of race. At the same time, though, I think this is a place that we can learn some lesson from Kant. Namely, not all conceptual divisions, even if, right? Kant's essays, the first and third essays did have racist comments in them, right? But setting those aside, Kant was aware of the colonial context in which the historical context in which he was dividing humans into different principal races, right? Because he had been lecturing on physical geography. He had been talking about like describing all these tropical peoples in racist ways all along. And he quoted Hume more than a decade before he published his first essay on race. So he was aware of the historical context in which he's dividing human beings, right? Even if you give a purely theoretical account of these, racial classification and things like that, he would be either dishonest or just clueless to think that this kind of division is not going to have any practical consequence. I think we should be very, like, I say this mainly as an example and a cautionary tale for a lot of us today. We may think that we're just doing purely theoretical work, but if you are someone like Kant, who's so powerful and who just kind of like comes in within, like, I like to think of like a system of knowledge production. Kant is part of this system of racial knowledge production. That's how I present him, right? His theory is going to have uptake, and his theory was developed in the context in which a whole race is being enslaved. And people were treating, Amerindians as nothing. So he was aware of all this, and he cannot just pretend that, well, I'm just doing theoretical work. I don't have to worry about practical stuff. And setting aside that he goes ahead, right? And he used his theoretical framework as this, like, you're right. He's using skin color as a base for dividing, because that's all he can say, scientifically speaking. But once he has this grid, very rigid racial classification, everything else is like got stuck. Everything else has a place to hold, right? Has a placeholder for all the, folk prejudices, or what I call Humean folk prejudices, associations that have already been in place. So I think it's, neutrality is a complicated question. So I think we have to look at where Kant is located. I call it, he's located in the nexus of meaning makers who would bring a lot of historical baggage to bear. So, whether he saw it or not, this very theory cannot have innocent consequence.
I think that last, so I think you're agreeing with me to a large extent, and I think, yeah. And what if he'd written his theory, biological theory of race, and said everything we would have wanted him to say about race? Wouldn't that have been fine then? He would have said explicitly that his theory has absolutely no evaluative content, and he would have said everything he should have said, and some people, some of his contemporaries already did say even. Wouldn't that have been possible? So why can't he write a biological theory of race and get everything right in his moral, in his moral and political assessment of race? I mean, that would be. It's not an impossibility.
I think you're right. I don't think I disagree. I think an interesting contrast here would be Blumenbach. Blumenbach, he honestly really was much more progressive than Kant was. Blumenbach knew that in his lifetime, his scientific theory of human varieties were being misused for racist purposes to justify slavery and all this kind of stuff. Blumenbach knew that. Once he knew that, he really proactively tried to counter that. Blumenbach was very much aware that your theory of race, even if you begin with this very innocent theoretical intention, can be misused and combined with social practices at the time. And Blumenbach did way more than Kant did, of course. Blumenbach would come back in his later work, he would cite, Black authors, and just went out of his way to acquire Black authors' works and try to say, look, I'm using these people to prove Black people are intelligent. Kant never did that, right? So I think the social context of social knowledge production is something really important to take into account, and then to see what other people around Kant were doing. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a really important issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you for the next comments that we try to be brief so everyone can talk, because we have less minutes than before. Yes, I want us to add what other people were writing, especially what people of color and outside of Europe were writing, right? Because if not, we are never going to get the picture right. Now we have Thomas.
Hello, thanks very much for the talks and the discussion. I want to get to what I think is the center of the discussion. You started, Huaping, you started with your criticism of Pauline Kleingeld. And when I heard, so I found that you always very convincing. When I heard Lucy's comments, I thought that she was going in exactly the same direction. And if anything, would be strengthening Pauline's views. So I want to get first Lucy to say whether she thinks that Pauline's view that Kant late in his life in Perpetual Peace, the passage you cited with the drinking of water and so on, did indeed change his views about slavery and colonialism, first point. Second point is, Huaping, you used a lot of lectures from physical geography and anthropology, but never told us about the dating. And the dating is, of course, absolutely essential for Paulina's hypothesis. So do you have any hard evidence that would be so strong and overwhelming that we could play it out against published text by Kant, which we normally shouldn't? And then finally, the question we are using in this discussion, slavery and colonialism as cues for Kant's views about racism. I remember this discussion at the Berlin Brandenburg Academy of Sciences, which many of you may have seen, where one of the results is that Kant could well have developed his views over slavery and colonialism in the 1790s, as Paulina says, but yet have remained a racist or have kept on making these racist remarks, which I think is actually the case. But there's that now if we accept that point, then how can we use still his remarks about slavery and colonialism as cues for his alleged or real racism? Thank you. The 3 points.
I think the first one was addressed to me.
Yes.
About whether Kant changes his mind or not.
Does Paulina's thesis still hold? Yes or no?
Well, I think that's a very complicated issue involving a set of questions about how one interprets the systematic works and a set of questions about hypotheses we make about the person Immanuel Kant's mind. And I think that I agree with her arguments that show both that the metaphysics of morals is inconsistent with not giving full juridical personhood to all humans on the planet, and also that he expresses the view that he thinks colonialism and slavery, chattel slavery, are wrong in the metaphysics of morals. So I think she's right about that. I think also it's compatible to hold those views consistent with being a racist. I mean, I assume that most contemporary racists in America don't defend chattel slavery. So, you know, I don't think that shows that Kant, the person, stopped being a racist. And it's quite hard, I think, to know what to think about what evidence we have about Kant, the person's mind and views on these questions. I think they might well have changed. I mean, we know that Kant changed his mind dramatically on a number of topics. We also know that when he did, he almost never signals it. You know, so somebody said to me recently, but if he changed his mind on race, why wouldn't he have told us that? But I mean, in the first critique, you know, he totally changes his mind from earlier work about the analytic synthetic distinction and whether we can have knowledge of the world in itself through reason. And he doesn't say, I used to think this other thing, I was wrong, and now I think this new thing. He says, like, everybody would think this. Here's what one thinks. So, you know, he does change his mind on really important topics. He doesn't say he's changed his mind on really important topics, the topics he takes to really important in his theoretical philosophy. So I think that's just a very complicated issue. What I've looked at more is the relation between his systematic views in the late political works and the kind of racism that would allow colonialism and slavery. And I think his views are not consistent with that. I also think that the groundwork wouldn't be consistent with that, although I agree with Huaping that the groundwork is an extremely abstract thing that is not directly about embodied human beings, but I think it is a fortiori about embodied human beings. But I think the metaphysics of morals is explicitly about embodied human beings on a finite surface of the actual earth. And in that he does very explicitly include all human persons and different peoples of the earth.
So Thomas, actually, I'm not sure I understood the second question. Are you saying that, are you asking me like whether any of Kant's later lectures said anything?
No, what is the reason for assuming that given the very strong evidence from the 1790s, where he's even emotionally, you could say, when he's talking about the Europeans drinking injustice like water, yeah, that you have equally hard evidence for from that time or later on from his published writings. Because this is a principle that I always follow. It's only under very difficult circumstances or conditions permissible to use non-published writings against the published writings. And I fear that you're doing that.
Okay, so I think there are a couple of issues here. So the first one about the published writings. So I'm trying to reject this view that, you know, when you read this context, the only way to read them is to say that Kant changed his racist mind, right? So it's like, yeah, I don't dispute that Kant said all these kind of things in later writings. My question is why at this particular point? So I'm trying to kind of take these read these comments in historical context. And Kant was late to the game in saying these things. Buffon actually spent a whole page saying how evil the slave masters were, things, et cetera, et cetera. And Edmund Burke as well, and made a lot of claims about, you know, all this kind of evil practice of slavery and things like that. I mean, there's nothing new there. But the question is, I'm trying to see exactly what's the link between these claims and his view about the status of the different races. Now, I think I'm trying to push back against the reading that, well, from these comments, we can read off some kind of racial egalitarian. This is what I'm not taking. This is the move I'm rejecting. So once you put things in historical context, actually the piece that inspired me most is by Inés Vardas. She made a really strong case against Kleingelt's interpretation of colonialism as entailing some kind of change of racial attitudes. So I think Inés made a really good point about how, if you consider the historical context and especially what the Great Britain were doing, Kant was really worried about some of these conflicts that are taking place overseas are, you know, threatening the prospect of peace, you know, in Europe. So this is a kind of, you know, trying to clarify what I'm trying to do here. I'm not trying to kind of trying to use the lectures to kind of crowd out, you know, to deny that Kant was saying, you know, saying these things. There's a broader point about how to use lectures. I think this is like a very typical strategy in saying that, you know, we try to weigh different texts, and we try to say we should, you know, put attention, place more weight on Kant's published publications that he did by himself and things like that. And I think let's not forget that Kant published all these race essays with the racist claims included verbatim through the end of 1790s. 1799, as both, you know, Bernasconi and Mark Larimore has pointed out, Kant reprinted these kind of things. So what his own mind is saying, was hard to say. But one thing I want to emphasize is that the audience, that's why I emphasize the ideology formation. It's not, that's why I'm trying to move away from the narrow question about what Kant was saying, you know, or thinking at a particular year or something like that. I think we need to kind of we shouldn't just to say, you know, discount or lower the weight of the lecture notes, you know, just because they are lecture notes, they're not his own publications. I think they can have just as powerful impact on the perception, on the worldviews of his audience as his publications. That's a you know, a separate methodological issue here.
Thank you. And now we have Timothy.
Thank you for this. I think it's an important topic. I'm curious about how this can be used, how in condemning, so I'm curious about this idea of non-reciprocal cosmopolitan right that you briefly mentioned. So I certainly think there can be an asymmetrical or unbalanced cosmopolitan right. That is to say, you know, he can be privileging Europeans. And I don't think that Kleingeld is necessarily right that he attributes full juridical personhood, as we've said, or at least full juridical personhood might be more akin to passive citizenship, right? Along those same second-class citizenship. So, I mean, there's sort of two ways you might interpret. So in your abstract, you take a very hard stance, I thought, which is like, no, these claims are baseless, right? And then there's this other side that says, no, Kant's not a racist, and these are, you know, these show it. And so in your talk, you seem to be much more, for lack of a better word, moderate, which is just like, well, we can't be sure about this, or this doesn't sort of prove that. So, I mean, I guess I'd press the sort of middle ground, or one middle ground, which is, at least it seems he's changed his mind, so that they do acquire a sort of juridical status. I think Valdez is right. This is not necessarily getting rid of hierarchy in cosmopolitan right. And I think that's what Valdez says, right? You get status for people, but that doesn't mean he gets rid of hierarchy, right? So, I mean, you mentioned, for example, about whether or not he counted indigenous peoples as nothing. And the commentator mentioned, well, in the context of the passage, he's talking about wrongfulness like water. He's talking about injustice. And so there's a passage in Perpetual Peace, I just put it in the chat, but I'm sure you're familiar with it, where he talks about the injustice that commercial states show in visiting foreign lands, which is tantamount to conquering them. And he talks about when they visited the Negro countries and so forth, they were to them countries belonging like no one, since they counted the inhabitants as nothing. And he refers to that as the inhospitable behavior. So it seems to me he's willing to use the term inhospitable against the Europeans, right? And so the limited cosmopolitan right, he's using it as a tool both to specifically say they're doing injustice, they're counting them as no one. Again, I'm emphasizing, I'm not claiming they're, you know, they may very well be Untermenschen and the second-class citizens of the world, right? I'm not claiming that. I don't think so, but I don't think that's dispositive, at least. But I do think, you know, I guess I would ask you to expand upon this idea that there's no reciprocal hospitality, especially since that's the sort of claim of cosmopolitan right. And the larger question about this is like, okay, Kant thinks that, you know, has Kant changed his mind such that there are important more statuses for indigenous peoples, et cetera, yet we can't conclude that he reaches full status for various groups.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you. I think it's a quite complex. If I'll give a try to just to say something about the non-reciprocal cosmopolitan right. So when I was saying non-reciprocal, I was saying that Kant was interested in, right, when he says the cosmopolitan right as the right to hospitality, right, not being kind of turned away with violence, right, by the so-called host. So of course, the historical context was that he was talking about European expansion. And so if it's a reciprocal, it would mean that, you know, the say, people from other countries can visit Europe as well. You know, you should treat them just the same as you expect them to treat you. That I don't see. And so that's the sense in which I'm saying that there is no reciprocity here. What exactly he's talking about is that Europeans, yes, you have the right to to be treated, to not be, right? You have the right not to be turned away, hurt. So when you visit the other land, they should treat you with, keep you safe, don't hurt you or whatever, or something like that. That's like this one directional way of looking at things. Jasmine Ghani has this paper from 2017. The main title is The Erasure of Race. She's exactly talking about the so-called provinciality of Kant's cosmopolitan right, if you read it in its historical context. And Jasmine Ghani was looking at this in connection with today's refugee crisis. Do they get to kind of be treated if the non-Europeans come to Europe? Would they, would kind of affirm the same kind of right? It's not clear from the context, at the very least. And so another thing is that I think I totally agree with you. There was about this middle ground. So for Kant, right, the inhabitants should now not be treated just as nothing. The question is, what exactly are they granted? Notice that Kant refers to them as inhabitants of the land. So if you also read that in connection with Kant's Anthropology, right, from 1798, in the section on the character of nations, which peoples did he include in the character of, in that section? The nations were all European nations, especially 5 major Western European nations. And it's all nations of the white race. And so that itself is also telling. So it's a kind of I think it's really realistic. If you don't see these other peoples have the kind of power that allow them to have this kind of equal standing with the rest of the world. So he is still looking at them from the perspective of the Europeans. He is worried about Europeans waging war, preparing for more war in Europe by doing all these things, doing all this expansionism, all these kind of things elsewhere, train their armies and things like that, so that they can keep fighting wars within Europe. And so this is again, Ines Valdez was saying, so at this point, Kant started really, really being really, really worried about the ramification for European peace, the peace in Europe. So I'll just stop there. I know we're running out of time. So.
Thank you. We are running out of time, but I just wanted to participate with a question. I agree that whether Kant, the individual, was racist or not is a non-important question. The main question here, I believe, is what is racism? I feel that we are not talking about that, and I am sure we are not going to be on the same page. Not you and me, Huaping, I mean all of us. Mm-hmm. Racism is not just some personal flaw a white person has by which he or she they say something racist. Racism is a system of domination, a social relation produced by Europeans to dominate and exploit entire populations in other places of the world. So it's not something you just can deconstruct yourself and stop being racist. That is not enough. You ought to be anti-racist. So maybe white people don't make these racist remarks, but do benefit from racism, because racism is structural and it is a word system, and it also structures academy and even this very event. So my question is, what do you think racism is?
Thank you, brilliant, Dr. Thank you so much for that question. I spent an entire chapter on that question. That's the chapter 2 on racism, exactly along these lines. I don't really have much to add. It is a structure. And so when we say anti-racist, I think people kind of willy-nilly just to say, okay, well, Kant has this moral universalism, therefore it's anti-racist because it's colorblind, right? That doesn't follow. Anti-racist, anti is an active indicate actions, struggles against existing structures of domination, exactly as you said. So that's why if we want to use Kant's philosophy at all, I say that in the conclusion, we should look at Kant. I love Kant's political philosophy. I read him not so much as a moralist, or he is that, but I think what I found particularly attractive in his work for doing anti-racist work is his close attention to political realities of his time and his willingness to adjust his positions, willingness to kind of think through the political realities of his time. And I think this is something I read him as very, in the conclusion, I invite people to read the appendix to Toward Perpetual Peace, where he talks about political prudence. And so we do have to have this, the right moral orientation, but then the hard work is how you navigate the political landscape. Especially now, we have this structure that we have inherited, that we're not just talking about theory anymore. We have all these entangled political powers that we have to deal with. Exactly that. Okay, thank you so much. Yeah.